It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
All right, so last week, we saw Saul in trouble in Gilgal, and he finds himself outnumbered by the Philistines. And this was a reaction in response to King Saul's son Jonathan's attack on the Philistine garrison up in Geba, which is in the area of Gibeah. So now King Saul, he's overwhelmed, and he's back in Gibeah with his son Jonathan with only 600 men, because all the others have deserted him out of fear. Now, with the Philistines, only about 4.5 miles away in Michmash. The Philistines, they're now in control of the whole area, the whole complete territory of Benjamin. And they've divided their raiding parties into 3 parts, and they're controlling all the roads, so no help can come to Saul, and they've cut off all their supplies. And with the Philistines having such a large army, their food, it's going to have to come from somewhere. So these raiding parties are going all over Israel and stealing Israel's food. And the raiding parties are sent to the north to Ophrah, and then to the west to Beth Horon, and then to the east toward Zeboim. But then there's a 4th detachment of Philistines that went south to Gibeah. And that was to keep Saul's army from moving up to Geba. And that's where that old garrison had been. So at this time, the Philistines were stronger than Israel in every possible way, and they could do whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted to do it, because the Philistine army here was immeasurable, which included at least 3,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen. So the response the Philistines had to Jonathan's attack on their garrison was massive. And then them having all this weaponry, and Israel, they're only armed with sticks and stones. The only other weapons that Israel had was just a bunch of farming equipment. And goads were these sharp sticks that with points to keep the oxen from kicking. And then they had these pitchforks, and they had plowshares. But they're all being sharpened by the Philistines. And they're sharpened at a very high price. And that's because the Philistines had deported all the iron workers out of Israel to keep them from having any iron weaponry. And so I would assume that at the brink of war, the Philistines probably weren't sharpening anything of Israel's at the time. And then on top of all this, strategically, the Philistines, they have taken the high ground. The high ground is always an advantage in battle. And with only having a sword or a spear, and that's only in the hands of King Saul and Jonathan, there's nothing that they can really do. And so you're going to see here that there's a really big difference between King Saul and his son Jonathan, where at this case, the apple did fall very far from the tree. So it's easy to see how overwhelmed Israel is here and how they would have no hope. Because Philistines are everywhere and there's nowhere to go and you're cut off from everything. So for Israel, this is an impossible situation. And you have no real weapons. You only have slingshots and bows, which are okay from a distance, but they're no good in hand-to-hand combat. So to me, this looks like those old movies where the villagers are all coming out with their torches and their pitchforks and trying to fight off the Frankenstein monster. So you see Saul here, and in his mind, he's being realistic. And he's probably thinking to himself, we don't want to provoke these people anymore. And everyone in Israel, they're looking at God only in the light of their circumstances, where it's only Jonathan who's looking at the circumstances in the light of God. And so now we see here that King Saul, he's sitting under his pomegranate tree. And so to me, this almost kind of sounds kind of peaceful, like he's living in Hawaii and maybe having a few of those fruity drinks. But you can picture him here, and he's sitting around with his 600 men, and he's not knowing what to do, but he has Ahijah, the priest, with him. And this is a new high priest. This is the great grandson of Eli, the high priest. And he's also from the line of Phinehas, who was that godless priest who was foolish enough to take the ark into the battle. And now we see that Uncle Ichabod, he's all grown up now. And if you remember, Ichabod, he was that poor baby that was born an orphan, whose mother, along with his father Phinehas, died the same day that the ark was captured. And Ichabod's name, it meant no glory, or the glory has departed. And so this has been a while. This has been over 2 generations since Samuel was a boy, because Ahijah, he would have had to have been at least 30 years old to be an active priest. And we hear that Ichabod had an older brother. His name was Ahitub, and he's the one who had this son named Ahijah, the priest. So God here, he has not yet removed the defunct priesthood that descended from Eli, and that won't happen until Solomon's reign. So King Saul here, he has access to God's counsel through the priest Ahijah from that rejected line of Eli, but he has it by the use of the Urim and the Thummim. And so if he wants to hear it, he can. But we don't see Saul wanting to hear or inquire from God. But Saul, he likes to look religious by having a priest around, but it doesn't seem like he really wants to hear what God is having to say. Because if he wanted to hear God, he would have probably sought Samuel as his counsel. But we don't see him do that, because it didn't work out for Saul the last time when he was told that the kingdom would be taken away from him and given to another man. And so he doesn't seek Samuel's counsel because Samuel doesn't compromise. Samuel only speaks what God says. But it seems that Saul, he gets along a lot better with this defunct priest that descended from the priest who was called the son of Belial. And so it sounds like he's more sympathetic to Saul, and he will probably do whatever Saul tells him to do. So Saul, he's content to sit under a pomegranate tree, and he's playing the victim of his circumstances with only this religious facade, because he only needs to appear spiritual and act religious. And so I don't get the sense that Saul, that he ever sees God very clearly at all. Because with God, it doesn't matter how many men you have, because God is bigger than any army or any circumstance. But Saul, he doesn't have that kind of faith. He's a carnal man. And now we're watching him, we're watching his character steadily deteriorate under the pressure, where he becomes this man that's full of impatience and full of unbelief. And now you compare Saul to Jonathan, who's already won 1 battle against the Philistines, even though his father didn't give him the credit, where Jonathan here, he is the only one in Israel looking at God in the light of these circumstances. And he doesn't see this as a military setback, but he sees it as a possible opportunity for God to work. And then we begin to see this pattern emerge here, where Jonathan initiates actions of faith to see if God is willing to prosper him in what he thinks God may be doing. Where his father Saul, he never initiates anything. He only follows up on what others have already started. And Jonathan here, he doesn't feel like sitting around under a pomegranate tree with dear old dad. He doesn't feel like sitting around talking about his glory days or listening to the stories of how helpless their situation is. So Jonathan, he doesn't tell his father about his plan going over to the Philistines' garrison. He only tells his armor bearer. Because Saul, in his unbelief, he would have never approved of what Jonathan was going to do. And I'm pretty sure Jonathan knows who his father is, because most children, they know who their parents are. And Jonathan probably already knows that his father would shut down his plans if he ever told him anything about it. In fact, even though Saul took the credit for Jonathan's last victory over the Philistines, In Saul's mind, Saul may be blaming Jonathan for that last battle, for all the trouble that they're in now. Or Saul may be thinking, Jonathan, because of that small attack on that garrison in Geba, where you thought you won a victory, all you really did was kick a sleeping giant that we're having to deal with now. But doing nothing and sitting underneath a tree is not acceptable to Jonathan. So he leaves with his armor bearer. He goes to look at this new garrison of the Philistines. And so now, with all the roads cut off being used by the raiding parties, where they're going is not going to be very easy to get to the Philistines' garrison. And so they're going to travel on this narrow path between two sheer cliffs to go over to the Philistine garrison. So Jonathan and his armor bearer, they are literally between a rock and a hard place. And one of these rocks is called Bozez, which means shining. And that probably means that the sun was reflecting off of it. And the other rock was called Sinai, which means thorny. And so going over there, Jonathan says to his armor bearer, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of the uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us. Nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few." So Jonathan, he's letting us know how he feels about the Philistines being in Israel by calling them uncircumcised. Because what he's meaning is that they are a godless people, that they are a people outside of the covenant, that they shouldn't be in God's Israel. And Jonathan is stating here that God is powerful. And Jonathan here, he has a strong faith. And he has a faith that the Lord may be willing to work with us, to partner with us, and that there's nothing restraining the Lord from saving by many or by saving by few. So God, he doesn't need a whole army. He just needs a couple guys who are willing to follow him. So basically, God plus one makes a majority. And it doesn't matter how many thousands of uncircumcised Philistines are there. And Jonathan, he's not just acting on his own feelings here. He's actually believing in God's promises to Israel, where it says, "You will chase your enemies and they will fall by the sword before you. Where 5 of you will chase 100 and 100 of you will put 10,000 to flight." And that's exactly what it says in Leviticus 26:7. And he may be thinking here about the battles like Gideon's with his 300 men. And we have the same kind of scriptures in the New Testament, like in Romans 8:31. And it kind of says the same thing here. It says that if God be for us, who can be against us? Where the only thing that can restrain the Lord is our unbelief. And that's like what it says in Matthew 13:58, where it says that Jesus, he didn't do many works there because of their unbelief. And so there would have been a lot of people who would have agreed with Jonathan, with what Jonathan was saying, and that was all theologically true. But not very many men would have believed it enough to act on it. But Jonathan did, to the point of acting on that theological truth in faith. Because the only thing that ever restrains the Lord from doing great works like this in our lives is our faith. And God, he is looking for people to partner with him, people that will trust and believe him, not just in theory, but practically. And I don't know if you can picture this here, but you have these 2 guys, and they're just 2 regular guys, and it's against an immeasurable Philistine army. And they have at least 3,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen. And they don't even have 1 horse. And they probably only have 1 sword between them. And a lot of people would say what Jonathan does here is just plain foolish, or it's presumptuous, that he's attempting some kind of suicide mission and that it's not very well thought out. But that's not what this passage is here to teach us. This passage is here to teach us how God can move on the heart of one who is willing to walk with him in faith, who will believe God without seeing every step laid out in front of him. And you have to see here Jonathan, he doesn't have a specific confirmed word from God. All he has is this hope in his heart. He has an impression that it may be God. And so he knows here that it could be wrong. And so he's going to seek further confirmation to see if what he is thinking is actually God guiding him. And it's probably in much the same way that he felt God guided him in his last battle with the Philistine garrison up in Geba, which was a much smaller battle. But I'm thinking that this last battle is the actual thing that had prepared him for this greater act of faith, where it's so impossible for a man to accomplish, but he's already seen God work in this same exact way in his life at that other battle. But sometimes when people think of faith, they think that faith is just looking at the most outrageous thing anyone could ever do in the name of the Lord, and then they just do it. But that's not faith at all. That's called presumption. Faith is not having to guess what God's will is for your life. Faith is, after you know God's will, being willing to do it no matter how overwhelming the circumstances are. So Jonathan, after he asked his armor bearer to go over with him to the Philistine garrison, and he's telling him that the Lord might be in this, his armor bearer says to him, do whatever is in your heart. And an armor bearer, he's not just like having your golf caddy. He's a warrior. He's the man who has your back. He's been picked out especially for you and maybe even probably by you. And this armor bearer, he is like-minded like Jonathan. And so the support of the armor bearer, this is Jonathan's first confirmation, at least to get them to the next step. And so as they go, they prepare a test, which involves the response of the Philistine guards and to see if God is possibly in this venture of faith. So Jonathan, he never asks God for the whole plan. He never asks him that ever. He's willing to take it just one step at a time. So Jonathan suggests that we'll just go over from a distance and we'll let him see us. This will be our act of faith. And then we'll let the Lord show us by the response if this is from him. And we'll figure it out by the way that the Philistines react to us. If they come down the hill and they start chasing us, we'll figure that God's not in it. But if they ask us to come up, then we're going to figure that that's from God, because it's more likely that they would try to keep these Hebrews away from coming into their camp. But if they ask us to come up, that will give us a chance to get close enough to them to fight them, because they're going to have to wait until they climb up there. And so they'll wait till they get all the way up before any of the other Philistines will know. Because this whole army, they're not going to really be afraid of two Hebrews. And so this is not like Gideon. So this is not a fleece. This is not like going at a surprise attack at night, because this is going to happen in the broad daylight. And they're not hiding like Gideon hid. They want to be seen. And they don't have the plan before they go, because what they're going to do is going to be determined by what the guards' reaction is. Because God here, he is only giving them one step at a time. So they're letting God plan this all out for them. And I do think if God did give them that whole plan at once, it probably would have been way too overwhelming. And so these guys, they're just walking through the doors that are opened before them. And that's all they have to do. All they have to do is follow. And that's the same way it is for us when God wants to do a work. He doesn't usually give us the whole plan. But people, we usually want to know the whole plan. And sometimes people, they'll ask questions and they'll say, well, how's this all going to work out? And what are you going to do? How are you going to do that? Don't you have a plan? And a lot of the time, the answer is, I don't know. The Lord hasn't told me that part yet. So you don't always have the answers for everybody's questions when God's working. But if you did have all the answers, it would almost make you wonder if it's really the Lord's plan or if it's just your own plan. And so then these guys, they go and they show themselves to the Philistine guards, and the Philistine guards say, hey, the Hebrews, they're coming out of the holes where they've hidden. And so what that means is that they're coming out of these holes to surrender, and that surrendering to them for them is a lot better than living in a hole. And a lot of the Israelites, a lot of the Hebrews, they did desert to the Philistines. But then the guards, they say, come up to us and we'll show you something. And that's like us saying, we'll teach you a lesson or we'll teach you a thing or two. And this was the answer they were hoping for. So this is the green light. This means that they're going to let them come up to them because they're not scared of these two little Jews. And it wasn't a straight walk up to the Philistines. They had to climb. So these Philistines, they had to wait patiently for them, and they don't cause any alarms because they're not scared of them. And sometimes when you're walking in God's will, the walk isn't always easy. Sometimes you're going to have to climb to get to the victory. And Jonathan and his armor bearer, they work quickly and they kill 20 men in the first half acre. And then the Lord helps them. And God brings an earthquake, which brings this confusion among the Philistines, where now the Philistines, they don't know where the enemy is. And everybody just starts hacking everybody. And then you're back at the camp and you're sitting underneath the pomegranate tree with Saul. And then the watchmen, they come up and they tell Saul, hey, it looks like the Philistines are melting away, which is not like this normal exit. It means that everybody's going every which way. And then Saul gets the sense that this is an Israeli attack. And so he calls the roll to find out who's missing. And he's probably doing this because he's more worried about who will get the credit for leading this battle because he's not leading it. And then he finds out it's Jonathan and his armor bearer that's missing. And I would guess that Saul, he wouldn't be too surprised at this. And it's probably kind of the same way it happened the last time Jonathan attacked the Philistines. And so here Saul, he calls for the ark. And calling for the ark is a way for Saul to look spiritual. But this isn't a time to look spiritual. This is not a time for him to stop and pray. This is a time for him to act. And some people think that Saul was actually considering bringing that ark into the battle of the Philistines, which we know didn't really work out very well the last time. That would be kind of the last thing you'd ever want to do. But in some of the manuscripts, it doesn't say the word ark, but it says the ephod. And that's what it says in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation. And that's what it says in their book of Samuel. And so Saul, he's asking Ahijah to put his hand into the pouch, into the priest's breastplate to get an answer from God and to use the Urim and the Thummim. And that's probably what it was. Because although Saul is asking for God's counsel, we see here he's not waiting very long for God's answer. So he tells the priest to withdraw his hand. And that's because Saul, he's hearing the battle. It's getting louder and louder. And so he's not going to wait any longer. That's because Saul, he's impatient. So he's already made up his mind for his own course of action.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,